Tomahawks are on the table. Donald Trump confirms on the eve of talks with President Zelensky, but Russia defies threats and new sanctions with massive waves of missile strikes and an armoured assault, the likes of which we haven't seen since March. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at the Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. I'm speaking to you today from Kharkiv, where I was woken up in the early hours by the sound of air raid sirens. This was one of the cities, one of the oblasts that came under a massive missile and drone attack overnight by Russia. We're going to divide today's update though into sort of three sections. We're going to talk about the statements, the war of words, the strikes which have hit Kharkiv and other parts of the country, and the sanctions. I'm going to start with the war of words. Donald Trump has explicitly discussed the possibility of sending Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles to Ukraine. This is something we've discussed before. These are formidable weapons normally fired from ships and submarines with a maximum range of 2,500 kilometers. Not only would they put Moscow within easy striking distance of Ukraine, but actually hundreds of Russian military sites, airfields and factories, including a drone factory producing the Shahed drones, which hit this country almost every night. His words were that if the war wasn't settled, he may send Tomahawks, he may give Ukraine Tomahawks. He said this is something that Russia would not want. He described them as incredible weapons, and he acknowledged that it would be, in his words, a new aggression. He subsequently talked about how Ukraine wants to go on the offensive, and sort of typical Donald Trump language, he said that that is something that he will have to make a determination about. All of this is sort of cementing this change of heart that we've seen in the White House, from being so sympathetic to the Kremlin to really aligning behind Ukraine, acknowledging, as we've seen from so many of Ukraine's allies, that President Putin has not been serious about peace, and that frustration has taken root in America, and Donald Trump now appears to be taking a different approach. These are, though, at the moment, only threats. He's also said, though, very significantly, that India will stop buying Russian oil. Trump claimed that he's had an assurance from India's President Narendra Modi on this, but he said it would take some time. That is really significant, because that, if that happens, would choke off a huge source of Russian revenue, and that revenue vital for prosecuting this war. On to what's been happening on the battlefield. We're going to start with the deep strike, the real conflict that is raging on both sides of the front lines. Russia overnight has unleashed a fairly massive wave of missiles and drones, some 320 drones, 37 missiles, many of them Iskander ballistic missiles, 2 of them Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, the ones that Putin claimed were unstoppable, but we've seen shot down by Patriots. Ukraine suggesting that at least 14 of those did get through. They hit targets in Kharkiv, Izium, Kropyvnytsky, Poltava and Chernihiv. This came after similar waves of strikes against the capital, Kyiv, and this city as well, which have plunged large sections of the country into darkness, and Ukraine has had to step up those rolling blackouts as its power infrastructure struggles to cope amid the onslaught of Russian bombardments. And on that note, we are now in what would normally be the heating season in Ukraine, when sort of municipal central heating is turned on and hot water is sort of pumped into people's homes, but that has been delayed from the last week of October and indefinitely, as far as I'm aware. People aren't sure when it's going to start, and that's also because of the strain on Ukraine's infrastructure. In the other direction, it's been very interesting that we've heard in the Financial Times a report that America has been supporting Ukraine's campaign of long-range strikes since at least July. Now, we've had indications that other allies have been supporting this campaign for some time, but the FT reporting that America has been guiding Ukraine on selection of targets, selection of flight paths, and the timing of these missions in order to best evade Russian electronic warfare and air defenses, to make these strikes more effective. And we've seen the effect of those strikes. The Feodosia oil terminal in Crimea was on fire for at least 3.5 days this week, struck on the 13th of October, still burning on the 15th. Ukraine's armed forces, the ZSU, saying that at least 16 of the 34 oil storage tanks on that site have been damaged. On the 11th and on the 15th of October, we've also seen strikes in Ufa, some 1,200 kilometers from Ukrainian territory, one against the Bashneft oil refinery and another on an industrial area in Org-Sinets. Both of those again appearing to target Russia's oil infrastructure. And slightly closer to home, there was a strike on the Sigma shopping center in occupied Donetsk. That was not targeting oil infrastructure. That was, Ukraine said, a site that Russian occupiers in Donetsk have been using to store and build drones. In the close battle, we have seen for the first time a large Russian armoured assault, a tactic which Western intelligence officials said that they hadn't seen since March. At least 35 Russian armoured vehicles, including tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, went into battle near east of Dobropilya in the Donetsk front. That's very close to where we saw that surge a few weeks ago, where Russian forces, using their infiltration tactics, managed to advance through weak points in the Ukrainian defensive lines. On this occasion, they sent motorbikes first, followed up by these infantry fighting vehicles and tanks to try and get troops into abandoned Ukrainian settlements. Now, Ukraine said that that attack was defeated, interestingly, in large part by pre-laid minefields, by drones and by artillery, suggesting that Ukraine's infantry were not called on into the close battle, but they did manage to stop it or stall it. The Western officials unsure at this stage why Russia appears to have made a switch back to that tactic, whether it's a deliberate evolution, whether it's a sign of desperation, or whether it was perhaps an opportunity that Russia thought it had identified in the front line. Finally, before we get on to questions, we're going to talk about the sanctions. The UK announced this week 90 new sanctions specifically targeting Russia's oil and gas industry, Rosneft and Lukoil, which together, it said, exported 3.1 million barrels of oil a day. The message from the British government is they're trying to take Russian oil off the market. They've also sanctioned in this package of sanctions 4 oil terminals in China, and that's interesting because it echoes what America's been talking about, which is trying to get after the secondary markets, the third countries which are continuing to trade in Russian oil. And that's why we've also seen sanctions aimed at the shadow fleet. 44 vessels identified as being part of that fleet have also been included in this raft of sanctions. As ever, thank you very much. If you have any questions, do ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next week. A few to get through today. How much fuel can Russia get to Crimea? Well, obviously we've been talking about the strikes on Crimea a lot. The routes into Crimea haven't changed. The Kerch Bridge, road and rail bridge, remains open. There are ferry terminals across the ferries operating across the Kerch Strait. And of course, Russia still has road access across what is known as the land bridge from occupied Mariupol, which it seized in the first weeks of the war, across to the top of Crimea. Clearly, though, Crimea's oil infrastructure is under immense strain. We've seen rationing at the pumps, fights breaking out, long queues at petrol stations, and a price cap imposed by the government for 30 days in a bid to try and ease public unrest. That's not just limited to Crimea. Those shortages are being felt across Russia as well. Clearly, though, when there is a fuel shortage, it's likely to be consumers who will feel it first, because if fuel has to be rationed, then it is likely to continue to go to critical industries, health, infrastructure, and in Russia's case, they will channel that fuel to the armed forces as much as they can in order to keep their troops in the fight. Question number 2, can Ukraine be criticised for hitting Russia's power stations? Zelensky signalled that Ukraine would sort of fight fire with fire in that sense. I'm sure some people might criticise Ukraine were it to do that. The moment they're focusing on Russia's oil infrastructure, Ukraine is fighting a war of survival. It has deliberately picked military targets and installations which are supporting Russia's military. But nonetheless, attacking Russia's economy through targeting its oil infrastructure is sort of reminiscent in a way of the blockades that we saw in previous conflicts in World War II and World War I, trying to inflict economic pain. And that will inevitably have knock-on effects to ordinary people. That's about perhaps trying to make ordinary people realise, understand this conflict, more about this conflict that's being waged in their name. What would be the tipping point for Putin to be removed from power? A really good question. I mean, I think ultimately unfathomable. Economic pressure, though, popular unrest, probably the most likely route. A combination of the elite feeling that their opportunities, their wealth is being significantly dented, their opportunities curtailed, and ordinary people feeling unhappy and sort of starting to manifest that unrest. Final question for today. Why penalise India for buying Russian oil when price caps on the exports of Russian oil were designed to try and limit the profits that Russia could make while allowing the export to continue to limit economic pain for the rest of the world? And we know that America has imposed secondary sanctions on India for its purchase of Russian oil. The point is, I think those price caps haven't worked. Russia's economy has sustained, in some instances it's grown because of this huge investment in the military. So those price caps haven't worked. The Ukraine's allies are looking at alternative mechanisms to try and hurt Russia's economy, to inflict, in Pete Hegseth's word, the US Defense Secretary, to inflict costs on Russia. So that's why Ukraine's allies are looking at penalising those other countries which are buying Russian oil. And it's worth pointing out, India did not buy much Russian oil before this conflict. This is an opportunity. This conflict has created an opportunity, or rather India has seen an opportunity to profit from the price cap and has been buying huge volumes of Russian oil, processing it and selling it on to other countries, huge markets, including, for example, Australia. Thank you as ever for watching. If you do have any questions, please ask them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time.